People were just doing it. So I went back to Ben and said, I'm not comfortable with this. I don't think you should do it. And one of the articles that Ben wrote was not in the book, but he published it on his website, describes this scenario and sort of thanks me for keeping him out of jail.
Welcome back to CZ and Friends, the podcast where we talk with legal leaders, technologists, and operators driving innovation inside their companies and beyond. I'm your host, Cecilia Ziniti. Today's guest is Jordan Breslow. His path runs from law firm associate to founding his own firm, then to in-house roles at Geoworks, Opsware, Silver Spring Networks, and now a chapter investing at New Island Capital, as well as a role at Etsy. Along the way, he taught as an adjunct at Berkeley, my alma mater, and NYU Law while still practicing in-house. He's got a fun story, and a reason that I've invited him is actually that Jordan was the general counsel for Ben Horowitz, who, of course, is now of Andreessen Horowitz. And he really talks about how Jordan was everything you need in a general counsel. So we're going to dive into that and why literally invited him to the show because of it. In this episode, we'll explore speaking truth to power, IP, and AI's questions around creatorship, copyright, IP, daily practice of integrity, especially when the pressure is high, which here in the Silicon Valley and beyond, that happens a lot. Let's dive in. Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Excited to be here. So
Thank you.
let's start with your timeline. So when did you become a lawyer? What kind of lawyer have you been? And just give us a general walkthrough.
Sure. I graduated law school in 1980 from Hastings Law School. So it's been a couple of minutes now since I've started. And just quick trajectory, I was very reluctant to work for law firms, and particularly big law firms. I sensed that it was going to be a choice between having a life or having a career. So I sought out a small law firm and joined a small firm in Oakland, worked there for a few years, did a little bit of everything, which is to say kind of committed malpractice in many different areas probably. And then kind of got the itch to start my own practice. I started a practice in Walnut Creek, California, kind of in east of San Francisco, and built a bit of a technology practice. After I kind of outgrew the ability to serve technology clients in a small firm, I merged my practice into a larger one, an established firm in Oakland, which had larger tech clients, Autodesk, probably the most notable, and Software Publishers Association back in the day. So I did all of that. And most of the time while doing that, I was thinking there's got to be another way I could make a living, because I don't like practicing law. I don't like timesheets. I don't like billing. It's boring. It's tedious. It's thankless. So I was exploring other opportunities and avenues of life, maybe go back to my first love, which is play music, maybe become an electrician. But I got a phone call from someone at a startup in Berkeley, California, which was called Geoworks. They were looking for their first in-house counsel, and I turned them down because it seemed insane. And about 6 months went by. I was more and more dreading every day in the office with a suit and tie. And they called back and said, we still haven't found anybody that fits the bill. And I said, okay, I'll be there on Monday. So I jumped ship, went in-house, and started an in-house career. You mentioned the series of companies I'd worked for. But working in-house was not always pure delight, but compared to being in a law firm, it was delightful. So as I said, we started in Geoworks, which was a startup in Berkeley. It's a story into itself, but it's my first experience being in-house. It's the first IPO that I participated in. It's also the first time I realized that the kind of fake it till you make it mantra was going to be my guiding principle for a lot of the work that I was asked to do, since I really had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. But Geoworks was a great experience. After that, I worked at LoudCloud, which was started by Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz, later changed its name to Opsware, went through a whole series of reinventions, which is much of the subject of Ben's book. Worked there until we sold the company to Hewlett Packard. I moved to Costa Rica and decided never to practice law again. That lasted about 2 months. And then I was persuaded to come back to the States and go to Silver Spring Networks, which is a kind of ostensibly a green tech opportunity, something I believe very much in. Worked there for a time. And then, as you mentioned, I did a kind of a segue out of tech, out of Silicon Valley, and worked for an impact investment firm, which was quite a fascinating place, but something I believe strongly in. I worked there for a while and moved to New York. And then I got a phone call asking me if I was interested in joining Etsy, which was looking for a general counsel. And I had been a big fan of Etsy as a consumer. And so I jumped at that opportunity, went to work for Etsy, went through the IPO process, stayed on for about another year or so, and then retired. Just effectively, I went back into private practice, represented small startups working from home, and moved my home to Mexico and then to California, to New York, back to California. Thank God for the ability to work remotely. It's been a blessing. And then I retired. I just recently turned 70. I think I'd had enough of practicing
Congratulations.
law. Thank you. And so now I'm a local rock star.
Local rock star. That's good.
Yes.
That's the apex title, as it were. So,
There you go.
so many interesting threads to pull. So, take us back to Geoworks, and you're on the eve of your first IPO and first IPO as a general counsel.
Hmm.
How did you do it? I mean, like, literally, like, I mean, you had been a law firm lawyer. You obviously, I'm sure, engaged law firms, but, at the time, this would have been, now I think having a tech IPO is sort of a badge of honor for a GC. Not sure if you knew that at the time, but put us in your headspace at that time.
Sure. Well, maybe just to back up a little bit, I started at Geoworks on like a Monday. On Tuesday, the president came down to my office and said, "We're going to have to do a bridge loan. We're short on cash. Could you take care of that for me?" And of course, I'll get right on that. He left my office and I called a friend of mine and said, "What the hell is a bridge loan?" So that was kind of set the stage for how I did many things there. There's just no way one can be prepared for all the things that get thrown at you as a general counsel. The word general fits. You got to do IP and technology and just, human resources and so many different things. So, of course, I relied heavily on outside counsel. Also, just every time I had to do something new, I studied the heck out of it and looked at, the documents people had done before. I tried hard not to just copy and paste documents. That's something I don't believe people should do. But it's just, again, you surround yourself with good resources. You kind of get smart um, and build good relationships with outside counsel. So that was kind of the prototype for everything else I had to do. When it came time to do the IPO, that was my first IPO. I've actually been through four of them at this point. I had really a fairly small role. And I think it was probably appropriate that I have a small role at that point because I didn't really have a lot to contribute to the process. Mostly my role there was to know who knows what within the company and make sure those people talk to the bankers and the lawyers and, sort of a conduit to get the facts and the truth out. With each progressive IPO I participated in, my role expanded. The one that I'm proud of, I would say, is the IPO at Etsy. And there I had a fairly leading role. I and our CFO, we decided we weren't going to let the outside lawyers or the bankers tell us how to do our IPO. We were going to tell them how we wanted it done. And that was fun and satisfying. We did some different things compared to your kind of standard IPO. But that was however many, 20, 30 years after my first one, a long time. So, you can't walk into a complex transaction, whether it's a bridge loan or an IPO or anything in between, and assume that you're going to add a ton of value. So I think you find where you can add some value and then you grow, you learn, you get better, you get more confident.
So that Etsy IPO, so fast forward to the Etsy IPO,
Mhm.
and you've got this, like, you're like, all right, we're going to tell the outside folks how we want this done, unique to our company. Any stories you can share or things you can go there. One of the things that our listeners or that I've picked up over my career of being a general counsel at different companies is that there's like a way to succeed and a way to do things, and then there's a way to succeed at that company, right? And even down to that CEO, right? Where it shows up in things like in the GCI product, we actually have a field where you can say how your CEO likes to be communicated with, for example. And that's something that I learned exactly like you of like every company is a little bit different and there's a million ways to succeed. So grounding the question, the Etsy IPO, you said you did things a little bit differently. Any examples or stories you can share there?
Sure. Well, a few, some I'll have to try to remember. But one of the things, it's sort of a soapbox I've been standing on for a long time is I like documents written in what I call plain English or, human language. When you get the army of lawyers in an IPO, they have, it's a word I sort of love and hate, vetted. Their documents, they work, they get the job done, and those are the ones they want to use. And they're quite terrified to change them. And I sent back to our outside counsel every single document that they sent to me and said, rewrite it. I want it redone in English. It fit my personality, but it also fit Etsy's personality. Etsy is a human website. I mean, it's a business about small people making a living doing creative and artistic things, and whether it's the employees, the shareholders, or the customers, the merchants, I didn't want to hit them with incomprehensible documents. So that was a pretty constant tug of war. I would say I won most of those battles, not all of them. There were times when the lawyers just said that if you change this, we can't protect you. It's, you're committing malpractice, whatever. But most of the time it was written in fairly plain English. Another thing we spent a lot of time thinking about at Etsy was, this gets a little technical, but we were a certified B Corporation, certified by B Labs. We were I think not the first, but certainly the biggest public company to be a certified B Lab
Wow.
corporation. We worked hard at that, and we wove that into our prospectus, into our story. I had to spend time on the phone with the SEC at that point, trying to help them understand what did this mean. Was it okay? Was it kosher with them? So we were successful in that. For those familiar with the laws of social enterprise, there's a difference between being a certified B Lab corporation, which is really a private company certifying you in a kind of a good housekeeping seal way, and reincorporating as a company goes by various different names, a benefit corporation or what have you. We wanted to reincorporate, be a benefit corporation, not just certified, but be a benefit corporation, which gives the the directors and the company certain obligations to the shareholders and to the public. And at that time, there were technical issues in the Delaware law that kept us from doing so. I went and met with the commissioner corporations in Delaware and persuaded them to change the rules, but not in time for our IPO. So, but
Wow,
it was
that's
an interesting
amazing. I hadn't heard that story. I wasn't familiar with it. Now, with ESG and the CSRD in Europe, it's definitely sort of at the forefront. So basically, so this was an example of like SGC, you basically pioneered the new law. And so did Etsy end up going back and reincorporating later?
To my knowledge, no. No, I don't think it did. It gets close to impossible. One of the uh, I'm trying to remember back now into the weeds, but there's a shareholder vote requirement for converting. Certain number of your shareholders have to agree to convert from a traditional corporation to a public benefit corporation. And it's a threshold that would be nearly impossible to reach once you're public. You have so many more shareholders, and to get,
Yes.
I forget what was it, three quarters or whatever it was, vote in
Would have
favor
been
of that.
impossible once you're public. Interesting.
Yeah, right. So we just did the best we could to act according to the principles that we would have followed anyway as a public corporation.
Love that. The plain English theme of, like, making sure that even a relatively dry legal document, a perspective, a proxy statement, what have you, can reflect the company, it's a great example. So, a friend of mine, Eve Saltman, was the GC of GoPro at the time of their IPO. They did a video. They literally did a video on a GoPro as part of their prospectus, and at the time, it was very controversial, and now I think companies have followed suit, but it's a great example of, like, if you're gonna be a shareholder in GoPro, you gotta be into video. If you're gonna be a shareholder in
Hmm.
Etsy, it's sort of like this human creativity and it's a consumer company. And
Hmm.
it's something that I think about now, like, I'm so glad that you highlight it for the pod, is that, like, a company is really reflective of these, like, very human things around who are the people at the helm
Hmm.
of that company, who are the users, who are the like, what is it? And so that's been really it's been fun for me, but also sort of shocking as a CEO now that, like, things that I'm into, like, even something like emojis, they're, like, part of our brand. Or, like,
Hmm.
the fact
Hmm.
that I'm super into giving very pragmatic legal advice, like you just explained, and people are constantly telling us, like, "Wow, GCAI really does give, like, bulleted advice that lands with our message, plain English, kind of like translating to land the message." So that's yeah, you hit on something profound. What was it like working for Ben Horowitz? So let's take a detour there.
Sure.
The story, so basically we'll drop it in the show notes, but, Ben Horowitz wrote a book. So he's, of course, the founder of Andreessen Horowitz
Hmm.
and, has invested in all the iconic companies of our era and really created, basically a new generation of venture capital in the spirit of the founder that he was, and in this case, the founder that he was, with Jordan and with Mark Andreessen. And I guess the book is called The Hard Thing About Hard Things, and it's, styled as a advice for CEOs. It's a really big deep dive into how, create a high growth company and how you have the success that he's had. But one of the stories that he tells, so I'll let you tell the story, or I'd love for you to tell the story, Jordan. So what happened, and how does Ben talk about it, and what the takeaway.
Well, let me back up to you started with what was it like to work for Ben? Um, and it was delightful. It was frustrating. It was so many things. Ben is a complicated person. He's super interesting person. I adore him. I mean, he's just unique, and we had a good, close relationship. We talked a lot about music and politics and just many, many things. We also had very different personalities, and I could tell a slight funny anecdote, but just he's a big Raiders fan.
Okay.
This football team, the Raiders. He once wrote a review, my annual review, and in it he said, "Jordan, you're doing everything right. I can't fault you. You're getting all the results we want. You're highly effective, blah, blah, blah." And if I had to give you any advice, I'd say that you just don't have enough bravado. You need to have more bravado. And, um, I kind of marveled at that and laughed about it, and I still laugh about it because I thought that was kind of funny to be saying you're doing everything right, but you should change your personality to be kind of more of like a jock and, punch people on the shoulder kind of thing. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. I just mentioned it because it's part of the complexity of who Ben was. Very thoughtful, creative, but I would also say, like he would fairly often he'd say, "Hey, Jordan, let's sue these people. They're pissing me off. I want to sue them." And I almost always talked him out of it because, lawsuits are just for the most part pretty stupid wastes of time and money. So there was, we had a kind of a good symbiotic relationship, I would say. He describes me in one article that he wrote as coming from Berkeley and having hippie sensibilities. And I think that's pretty fair. And Ben also grew up in Berkeley and was the son of a lefty who became a far right pundit. So it's just an interesting thing. And Ben's very into rap and hip hop culture. Every one of our conference rooms was named after some hip hop artist. And every time he sent a memo to the staff or to the company, it started with a quote from some rap song. So just an
And
interesting
he's done that in the
mix.
book as well.
He
Like,
does in the
he's
book
got,
as
like,
well.
"More money, more problems," all that stuff. Like, yeah.
Right.
No, that's fascinating. So and even
Yeah.
just these personality aspects that come through, like, that's
Right. Yeah.
lovely.
There's a lot of personality to Ben. So along the way, we had already become a public company. We hired a new CFO, and she'd come from a company called Mercury International. And she had recommended to Ben that we adopt a practice that they had adopted at Mercury, which the short phrase is backdating stock options. Technically, it wasn't exactly backdating, but the principle of a stock option is you're supposed to value the option, price it at the value of the stock on the day of the grant. And what Mercury was doing was picking the value out of the past 30 days, the lowest price on the 30 days prior to the date of the grant, and say, let's go with that. So if the value fluctuated over the course of the month before you get your grant would be priced at the lowest price that had occurred in the past 30 days. So she I recommended it highly. Ben came to me and said, "Jordan, our CFO wants to do this. What do you think?" And as going back to my bridge loan question, I said, "I have no idea. Let me figure it out." So went and researched it. I talked to other GCs. I talked to our outside counsel, and it seemed like everybody was doing it, but nobody could convince me it was legal or at least accurate and honest. And even if it was legal, are you accounting for it in the proper way? People were just doing it. So I went back to Ben and said, "I'm not comfortable with this. I don't think you should do it." That's the short version, I guess. And Ben said, "Well, Jordan, I trust you. I trust your judgment. So we won't do it." So we didn't do it. And shortly thereafter, the stock option scandal erupted. The SEC started chasing companies who had done this. Some people went to jail over it. A lot of people lost their jobs. Some general counsels lost their jobs, and I feel were probably thrown under the bus, but it was a big storm. And one of the articles that Ben wrote was not in the book, but he published it on his website. Describes this scenario and sort of thanks me for keeping him out of jail, effectively.
Love that. It's good. Yeah. So you've talked about since then and through that story, just the integrity of it. Is that really the core? That's the core of the job, right? Or how do you think about it? And, you get in there and we talked about the IPO and you build your skills and you want to be a great GC. But like, I mean, that's an important moment. But how do you think about that as being the job or not the job or how is it part of the job?
I think it's fair to say that that was, as you said, a moment, and moments like that happen with varying degrees of frequency. It's not a daily occurrence, right? You're in Silicon Valley, something crazy happens every day, but most of the time it's just how do we get this done? Let's get busy, let's get creative, and it's not moments where your integrity is challenged. I just think it's a matter of keeping your sort of ear open to situations that don't feel right. And, the simple saying is trust your gut. There was something about this backdating thing, even it wasn't even called backdating at the time. It was just a way to arrive at a value for the grant. But there's something about that said, this doesn't feel right to me. So I'm going to not just do my usual lawyering, throw this transaction together or whatever. I'm going to think about this kind of hard. I'm going to talk to people. I'm going to take advice. The challenging thing for me in this one is that the advice I was getting was from some very prominent Silicon Valley lawyers and law firms saying, this is okay. Everybody's doing it. It still didn't feel right to me. And I guess what my gut was saying is just because everybody's doing something doesn't make it right. So I think it's just keeping a little bit of your antenna up all the time. Like, is this just another transaction or is there something about this that doesn't feel right? If it doesn't feel right, listen to that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I felt a little bit that way about SPACs. So there was a period of about 2 years, or maybe even less, about a year, where the hottest thing was SPACs. And it was like, we're gonna do this. And I even at the time, I was looking for a new general counsel role, and I hadn't had a IPO experience, and I hadn't had specifically SPAC experience. But I remember thinking, like, this seems too good to be true. Like, IPO is a thing for a reason. And I had that same idea, but it is very hard to stand up in that moment and do it. So, like, any advice for, younger GCs or people who didn't, at that point you had been a public company in your prior role, you'd interacted with the SEC, you were at least, had enough expertise to be able to question the expensive law firms telling you what they told you. How do you do it? Like, is it just the hippie sensibility, or like, what is
Mm,
it? And I'm, imagine whippersnapper me or whippersnapper version of me facing that kind of situation. Let's say it's once a year, twice a year, depending on the situation. What do you do?
sure. Good question. Well, I'm not sure this is directly to your question, but I think it informs the way I think about it is one of the reasons Ben was willing to listen to me and even stop something in its tracks is that I was in the habit of finding a way to say yes as many times as I possibly could. Um, and this is something I've mentored a lot of lawyers along the way, particularly younger lawyers. And coming out of law firms, it's a great education, but it's also a handicap because you're mired in the sense that your job is to identify risk and mitigate risk. And so you sort of see anything and you think, how can I say no to this? Or what's wrong with this? Or, where's all the risk in this? I've got to raise a bunch of red flags. And that just had never been my style. Obviously, I would identify internally what the risks are in my head. But that's only the first part. It's like, okay, this is a challenge. Now, how do we do it? And how do we mitigate the risk? But how do I get the prime objective of closing this deal or buying this company or doing this IPO? First thing you have to do is build trust by being an ally and not being the naysayer. So that's part of it. Part of it is building a personal relationship. So building the relationship with the person you report to, in this case, the CEO, was also super important. Um, so both of those gave me the confidence to say at various points when my gut was telling me this is not right. I don't think I could have started my career doing that. Just to be realistic, if I'm giving advice to young lawyers, it's going to take a little while, I think, before you have built trust in yourself, others trust you, and before you can sort of prioritize the wrongness or rightness of things that are being done in business. The business world is not the same as the real rest of the world in my mind. People stretch the truth all the time. People take shortcuts, do things that are bottom line focused that aren't necessarily human focused. And if I said no to every time I was uncomfortable because of that, I would have failed quickly. So it's in another way of saying it, I suppose, is you choose your battles. Keep your antenna open when something really feels wrong. Find a way to say no. Ideally, which didn't much happen in this case, but ideally find a way to say no, but, or yes, and however you want to put it. But, let's not do that. But here's something else we can do instead that'll get the result you want. That's the best outcome, I think.
I love that. Also, some good themes. We had Doug Lees on the podcast a few weeks ago, and he put his entire team, he was a GC become CEO, and he put his entire team, 2,000 people through improv training, where it was literally the yes and of like,
Hmm.
okay, but this corollary of like be yes and so that when you say, yeah, no, you can mean it and you will be listened to. I think that's a maturity and a journey that has been a theme, for certainly in my career, but also, on this podcast and also just for in-house legal, but just also for business in general, right? That
Yep,
it's like
sure.
that is something to that the like builder's mindset that obviously, Ben Horowitz has espoused that getting there and being part of the journey and having, a rewarding career where you're listened to and have an impact is like you have to figure out that balance. I love that advice. So this is a good one.
Yeah.
I'm gonna clip this one out. So watch out my LinkedIn. It is coming. But good advice. Awesome. All right. So let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about AI. So obviously Etsy, big part of your role there would have been brand protection, would have been IP, copyright considerations. You mentioned you're a musician. So let's start with the kind of macro question. Where do you think this sort of like IP new creators get rewarded if their work is used for AI? Kind of the big sort of big fair use question. What's your take?
Yeah. Well, I do lean heavily in favor of artists and creators. Fancy myself one at times, surround myself with musicians, computer programmers, authors. And I think copyright law has throughout the years struggled to maintain a balance so that authors, creators are rewarded, but don't end up sort of monopolizing their creativity. And that's the sort of the inherent struggle in copyright law. Sometimes it's done a good job of striking that balance, sometimes not so good. I feel what I would like to see is a system somewhat analogous to what happens in music. So I mentioned I'm in a band. We play cover songs. I make my, tens of dollars a year as a musician, sometimes even $100 a year as a musician. So it's a hobby. But I get up on stage with my friends and we play songs written by somebody else. And so I'm profiting, even though it's not much of a profit, but I'm profiting personally and emotionally from somebody else's work. So I realize that person might not appreciate it. In the music world, there's through ASCAP and BMI, there are mechanisms for the creators to be compensated. So if a venue has musicians playing in it, the venue gets a license, the money goes to ASCAP, it gets distributed out amongst the authors, the publishers, etc. It doesn't always necessarily compensate them well, but I would like to see some sort of analogous system. It seems to me, from a legal point of view, from my study of the cases in IP law, correct analysis that if you're using all the works of all these authors to train your AI model, you don't have to pay them for it, at least under copyright law. That seems like the right, technically correct answer, but it feels wrong. And it feels wrong partly because some people and a small number of people are getting inordinately wealthy or trying to get inordinately wealthy or wealthier by taking advantage of this aspect of copyright law that they don't have to pay people. And yet they're going to, in one way or another, monetize their AI. They might be making it available for free right now as a teaser, but they're in it for the money. And it bothers me that they're going to profit off the labor of all of these authors. I don't know that the copyright law is going to get to the point where I would like it to be. And I think for good reason. If I read a book and I learn from it, I shouldn't have to pay an extra fee because I learned from it. And if so I think it's a legit point as long as the AI isn't itself producing output that's a copy of the original. I think that
Right. Yeah.
copyright
That's
will,
the technical distinction. Yeah. The
right,
regurgitation point. Yeah.
right.
So a lot of, I mean,
So,
it's funny because I thought when we did the show that the kind of does something feel right, sort of instinct things that trust your gut we talked about would not
mm,
actually translate to this segment of the show, but I think it does. Like, and this is something that I've said where, is this the Napster moment where Napster came out when I was in college and we had basically like a server where you could get any music you wanted. And that's literally how it worked. And I knew at the time, this is a little sketch. Like I remember thinking that. And it was like we needed that commercial framework to come out. And eventually, obviously we have iTunes. So I do think there is a commercial solution. I like that. But I also like the sensitivity of like, okay, in music, this exists. Can we create this for AI? So yeah, that'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see. I think it's the thing of our era. And also, a little hint of platform stuff there too, right? Obviously a lot of creators on Instagram, a lot of creators on social, and the really, really ultra rich are of course the people that own the platform. So yeah, that's fascinating. So what do you think I mean the bold prediction, do we get there? Do we get to some kind of system to reward creators for the use of their work in AI? Like tactically, how do we go
Hmm.
from iTunes to Napster in AI? What are your predictions? Or Napster to iTunes,
Well,
I guess.
you asked me that in a moment where I'm perhaps overcome with a fair amount of pessimism about accomplishing good things in the near term. We don't need to dive into politics, but suffice it to say, I feel like
Mm.
we're moving in the wrong direction in a lot of ways as a country, and getting kind of interesting legislative, creative solutions. It doesn't seem like this is the time when that's going to
And that is something where these kind of waves of political view, but also of is actually tied up in copyright and it's tied up in
happen.
some of the considerations that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good I think that's a fair assessment. All right. So in terms of litigation, if you've been in companies that have had litigation, you've managed
Mm-hmm.
litigation. If you were advising a startup today in this space, what's your advice? So let's say you're a hot AI startup and you train on lots of stuff. What are you telling them?
Litigation. I'm so not sure I understand your
About
question,
summit for
Cecilia.
litigation, about going into a high risk area. So one of the things that another Andreessen Horowitz partner, Andrew Chen, talks about, he was early Uber. And he makes the case that essentially the fact of Uber's illegality, like that there were taxi medallion requirements and other permit requirements in all the cities in which they operate. But basically the stomach to sort of be like, all right, this is technically illegal, but we're gonna talk with regulators. We're gonna make this happen because that's what the business model requires. So he talks in his book Network Effects about that. He's talked publicly about it. But I guess for startups in either regulated areas or creative areas, privacy, all these things, like, if you were hired as a GC of one of an AI type company, well, first of all, would you take the job? So maybe that's the question. You're retired, but assuming you weren't,
Right.
and second of all, you're hired. Are you like, all right, you better raise a lot of money to pay for this? Are you like, okay, do these other things to make this okay? What's the, I get asked this a lot. And now that I'm sort of, people know that I'm a GC and I feel, feel strong about these issues. I get LinkedIn DMs basically all the time asking me that. So
Okay.
assuming that I'm in a good way and I feel like I want to help these folks, what am I telling them?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to maybe I'll back up. Would I take the AI general counsel position? I would not, partly because I'm retired, but even setting that aside, I spend a lot of time in tech, and I, for the most part, have very strongly mixed feelings about whether tech is good for the world. And I have great misgivings about AI as the next thing that's not going to be great for the world. And I guess I believe strongly in the sort of the law of unintended consequences, that, be careful what you create and careful what you wish for. If there were an opportunity to work for an AI company that was sort of mindful of all of this, and I'm sure they're out there. I know people talk about, we have about their standards of controlling the AI and alignment with human issues and morals and that sort of thing. So that might be interesting. It's like, I mean, the AI, it's here, it's coming faster than we even thought 5 years ago in terms of moving towards sort of more general intelligence. So it's coming, and maybe this is something I think about a lot actually, is like, is it better to opt out of participating in something or get involved and hope to have influence from within to steer it in the direction you'd like to see it go? I think that's a timely question in general, because a lot of people, whether it's in private industry or even more notably in the US government, are being asked to do things that they don't want to do. And the question is, should I stay? Maybe I can influence this administration or this business executive team from inside, and so I'll stay. Or maybe that's just a pipe dream. All I'm being, I'm just going to be co-opted into doing things I don't believe in. So I'll qualify my, would I take the GC position? I probably would if I thought I could influence it and the people around me were values aligned. Okay. But I would not want to just, oh boy, AI is the greatest next thing and I'm going to get, rich off the next IPO. I have a lot of trepidation about where AI is going to lead our society. Um,
Interesting.
that's that.
I love that. But I think it's an important point where I've actually seen, had that exact calculus where I've seen people do that very successfully. So at Amazon, I was a product counsel. And one of the responsibilities I had was compliance with the CVAA, the Communications and Video Accessibility Act. And it was essentially making Amazon services compliant for use by individuals who are blind or individuals who have hearing impairments and so on. And We had an incredible, basically, director of accessibility. And he said, I've been an advocate for accessibility for 2 decades, but the impact I can have here at Amazon, having the influence to do so in this case, we launch video descriptions, but essentially that he could take this like goal of being good for the world and from the inside, exactly as you said, have far more significant impact than he could from the outside. So that's interesting. I love that point. You're hitting on all my the big rocks in tech of what I think about. So this has been a super fun conversation. So let's go with some quick takes. So a book, idea, or mentor, podcast, what have you, that's influenced your leadership in your life.
You know, I knew you were going to ask that question, and I have struggled to come up with an answer that's is
No
really,
problem. No
you
problem.
know, there's no, I just can't think of a single particular book. I did when I first joined LoudCloud. I was not the original general counsel. The general counsel was a man named Chuck Katz, who I'm very fond of. And the one thing he told me is to lead with praise, and I think that's just generally good advice. I've worked in cultures where shaming and humiliation are the order of the day, and I don't think you inspire great work out of anybody through fear and intimidation. And so if you're managing people, you have to coach them and get them to do better, perform better, be their best selves. But I do think it's a useful paradigm for all your interactions with people who you're training or leading along the way. So give you that.
All right. You've said before that life is too complicated for a single piece of advice. But besides, so you said lead with praise. You said say yes and so that when you say, oh no, you'll be trusted. Anything else to leave our listeners with?
I think just be yourself. I think try not to. I think a lot of us grow up seeing lawyers on television and trials, and we have this whole image of how lawyers are supposed to behave. It's always, again, it's back to my conversation with Ben about bravado. I'm not full of bravado, and yet I was very successful, in my what I needed to do because I was myself.
Love that. Yeah, it was like I keep coming back. One of my idols is Dolly Parton, and she says, "Figure out who you are and then do it on purpose." It's like
Right?
that's right,
Yeah.
and I've
Right.
definitely seen that. I love it. I
Yeah.
love it. I love
Right.
it. Where can listeners connect with you? I guess maybe they need Costa Rica tips or anything like that. Where should they go?
Well, LinkedIn is probably, if a way, as I said, I'm retired, but I'm still happy to give people counsel and advice. Along the way, I had some people I had a mentoring relationship with where we'd get on a video call once a month and just talk about their career, what's going on and challenges, that sort of thing. So I'm available for that. So LinkedIn's probably good. Other than that, come up to Lake Tahoe and the North Shore, which is where I live. You can hear my band called Down the Rabbit Hole perform at mostly summer concerts. So you can
I
find me
love
there.
it. I love it. And it has a legal link too in the title of the band. I love that. So good.
There you
Awesome.
go.
Jordan, this has been so much fun. Thank you for joining
Thank
us
you.
today.
Been my pleasure. Lovely talking with you.
That was my conversation with Jordan Breslow, a lawyer who's shown courage and kindness can coexist and that you can be yourself and be incredibly successful as a lawyer as he has been. If you're thinking about what it means to lead with integrity, especially as AI and technology keep reshaping our world and our work, I hope this conversation reminded you that principle can actually be a form of power. Follow CZ and Friends wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on LinkedIn. You can follow Jordan on LinkedIn. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.